Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. SANS 2022 report, Moving to a State of Zero Trust, sponsored by Cisco Secure, Corelight, Devo, ExtraHop, and Perimeter 81. My name is Carol, author of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromiley, SANS analyst, Tom Clavel, Director of Product Marketing at ExtraHop, John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight, and Tal Laufer, VP of Product at Perimeter 81. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hey, excellent. Thank you so much, Carol. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. Really looking forward to bringing this webcast out to the SANS community. First off, I don't know if everyone can tell, but we've got quite the lineup of folks joining me on this webcast here. Cisco, Corelight, Devo, ExtraHop, and Perimeter 81 all coming to the table to talk about moving to a state of zero trust. Now, before I go too far down the road, I want to talk a little bit about this topic and I think why this is something that, first off, I'm really glad everyone's joining us for, but second, why I think it's a topic we need to start having discussions around if we haven't started already, or at least why you, our attendees, need to start having discussions around if we haven't already. First and foremost, I am well aware that from a SANS perspective, we are hot on the heels of the DFIR Summit that just wrapped up in Austin, Texas. We're also a week off the heels of the Black Hat DEF CON summer camp out in Las Vegas. Long story short, InfoSec is a huge, big buzz amongst the community right now. Folks are talking about solutions, implementations, technologies. What should we be doing next? How do I defend against this? How do I defend against that? So on and so forth. And a lot of those themes resonate and tend to get folded into the discussion that we're going to be having today, primarily because we're not here necessarily talking about a particular threat or a particular specific technology, if you will, but more about a framework or a model, an infrastructure approach, a sort of design that we can use to help defend what I'm going to call, and probably what some of you have heard me refer to before on webcasts, is like that modern enterprise where we're at these days. And I like using that term because I think, and obviously this isn't going to apply to everyone, but I know some of my panelists will agree with me, and maybe I'll ask them later on today as well, or later on in this webcast. I think that what we have started to see from an enterprise makeup looks nothing like it used to before. I know a lot of you out there, and I'm talking with companies on a daily basis as well. They're just viewing things differently these days. Again, the reason I mentioned some of the most recent conferences that were just going on, I heard a lot of buzzwords going on the floor, especially when I was out at Black Hat, folks talking about attack surface management, talking about limiting or lowering their attack surface if they can. Well, that starts with understanding your attack surface. We can't limit or lower something unless we know what's about it. I heard folks talking about access controls. We're concerned about ransomware. Everyone's concerned about ransomware, as always. We're concerned about these very different elements, but all in all, I think what everyone's really saying is, hey, look, if I was having to defend against these things, 5 years ago, 4, maybe even, 3 years ago, I think my approach would be a little bit different than it is now, just because of how much has changed. And we're going to talk about some of those changes in just a moment. And I think that gives way to this discussion here when we talk about moving to a state of zero trust, because we're going to talk about things like lowering that attack surface. We're going to talk about things like lowering my risk of ransomware, or at least decreasing adversary success when they get in my environment. How do we go about dealing with an ever-changing cloud hybrid model that has applications and instances spawned up every 3 seconds? How do I get a security team that can track alongside a development team when the development team is told to develop at a speed that the business can grow, and the security team is told, hey, do your best to keep up and keep it secure? Well, we've got to find some sort of a compromise between those two. We've got to find, and my opinion, technology that can help get us to that happy medium between the two, where the business can grow at the rate it needs to, but that does not cause any issues from a security perspective. And I think that's an interesting starting point for a lot of what's going on out there. I'm not sure if anyone else feels this way. It feels like sometimes we get a lot less like super big public breaches Whereas before, maybe, years ago, we used to have, it felt like super big breaches happening all the time. Today feels a lot more like vulnerability announcements leading to breaches, ransomware incidents, of course, taking place. And then, we start to also, I think the ransomware gangs and the various criminal outfits out there have also gotten really big in promoting their name and getting themselves out there. I saw an article on a relatively, reputable news source the other day that was comparing the differences between ransomware gangs over the past 3 to 4 years. And I have to think about, look at where we've come as an industry, that someone sat down and took the time to provide an informative comparison between criminal gangs that are out there. And I think, it's a really interesting way to think about, what my approach, or I should say the adversaries' approach, has changed over the past few years. It's time to make sure our technology and our access controls and the way that we protect our network is up there as well. The way that we protect our environment is changing at the same rate. And that was, I think, a really good precursor that led us into this discussion of moving to a state of zero trust. So it's just me for the first 30 minutes or so of this webcast. I want to talk to everyone about the company white paper that we wrote to go along with this. FYI, if it's not in the chat already, the link to the white paper should be dropped in the chat very, very shortly. Hopefully it'll be in there and you'll be able to grab a copy of that if you'd like to. But I will note that when we get to our panel, about half an hour in or so, I'm going to be joined by Tom, John, and Tal over from ExtraHop, Corelight, and Perimeter 81 in respective order. And we're going to move towards more of a panel discussion about moving to a state of zero trust, what zero trust looks like. But that being said, for anyone watching this, if you've got any questions, comments, hey, Matt, you're way off base, or hey, I agree with this, or I don't agree with that, do me a favor, throw those into the Q&A window here in Zoom, and we'll happily fold those into our discussion as well. I just want to give everyone a chance to come on board and talk a little bit about how they feel about this, but we are always looking for any sort of community feedback that we can certainly get. So by all means, please use that use that Q&A window as much as you can. That being said, I'm going to move now into a review of the white paper before we get to our panel discussion. First and foremost, quick agenda here for us today. What I wanted to do in this webcast is really walk through the different steps of the white paper, because we use a lot of the paper to talk about what that zero trust implementation looks like. We do reference very heavily on the NIST materials as some of the best practices, some of the guidelines and standards out there. And I'm going to talk about that. But remember, this paper, the goal of this paper is moving to a state of zero trust. This is not you've got zero trust in place, now you're all set. This is hey, Matt, my organization is thinking about this, but we're not sure what's going on here. We're not sure what this means. I've seen these words thrown around marketing materials. I heard people speak them and say them in Vegas and Austin, but I'm not really too sure about exactly what this looks like. Then perfect, you're in the right place. We're also going to line that up to a few different case studies where we're going to talk about where adversaries find success and implementations of zero trust that might limit that success or make the management and securing of your organization a little bit easier as well. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to repeat, not entirely, but I want to draw the focus more on the past. I went 2 to 3 years in this slide right here. I went 2 to 3 years, but that does not mean that we can't expand the discussion or expand the time frame further if need be. But I said over the past 2 to 3 years, I think we've seen some of the greatest shifts, and I know a lot of the organizations I talk to have seen some of the greatest shifts. First off, an increase in the use of cloud technologies in all ways, shapes, and forms. Whether it's migrating a physical data center up to the cloud in almost a replicate form, or if it is redesigning applications to go serverless or containerized, if it is expanding our Active Directory up to the cloud while keeping folks on-prem, if it is utilizing third parties to offload some of my services or to outsource some of my services out to a third party just to make things easier, or to provide for a more, and second bullet point coming in here, a more remote, mobile, and global workforce that, quite frankly, and I hear a lot of this, I see a lot of this discussion, and we'll talk about this in just a second here, but a workforce that requires anywhere access. Now, that second little sub bullet there, I think that sometimes doesn't line up with what a lot of organizations are saying or thinking. And what I mean by that is, the more I see us kind of have to continue this trend of everybody's remote, I do see organizations starting to come back in, starting to fold back in, require a few days in the office here and there. Conferences are starting to get back in person. Maybe we're starting to return to the way things were, but I'll be honest with you all, I don't think we're ever going to get back to, and I think this is a positive, we're ever going to get back to exactly the way things were before. Your organization made strategic investments and started initiatives early or canceled initiatives based on, we're not sure how long this thing's going to last. For those of you out there who had a workforce that maybe all lived in 1 or 2 cities and were told you can now live anywhere because the technology allows for that, you've got workers spread across the United States, spread across the globe, potentially. Long story short, that change in the workforce, I think, is here to stay. Now, does that mean that the percentages might shift in certain areas? Of course they will. We might have some folks start to come back into those physical buildings, if you will. But I think we're going to continue to see that traveling, that remote, that global workforce out there that simply says, I need, you instated a policy that allows me to live and operate from where I want to. I'm going to exercise that policy to the fullest extent. But here's the funny thing. As a company, as the infrastructure team necessarily, you've got to provide the infrastructure to make that happen. And as a security team, which is who we're obviously talking to the most today, doesn't mean no one else is here, but security folks usually end up on these SANS webcasts. Your job is to help secure that infrastructure that's been put into place. So when I say a global workforce that requires anywhere access, I'm talking about those things that may already be in place or the initiatives that are being put in or the technology that's being implemented right now. And then I think all of this really culminates into that kind of enterprise footprint, if you will. I've also seen this, I shouldn't say I should say we also know this as an attack surface. How big, how wide is your organization on the internet? How big, how wide is it? What's publicly accessible? What's not publicly accessible? And the list here just continues to grow. But we have to consider the question of how have we been securing these various elements? And when I say the list continues to grow, I think about some of the steps I have to go through for personal authentication. And sometimes we get into multi-factor authentication. There's things like tokens out there, those YubiKeys or single touch tokens, or the FIDO2s, that's what they're called. Or we can get into multi-factor with codes, pushes, SMS codes, and things like that. We can get into internet access lists that only require connectivity based on certain VPN rules. We can get into firewall rules that only allow certain things in. We could continue to line up the various technologies that help us secure and defend these various networks out there, help us secure and defend some of the various technologies that we have out there. But my point is, I think that a lot of these changes that we're seeing are going to continue to either grow, but at a minimum, they're going to continue to persist. And then comes the unfortunate, wicked truth about all of this as well. Adversaries are still finding success. They're still finding ways to break into these. I don't like to name and shame, and I'm not doing that whatsoever. But if anyone has not had a chance to go back and read some of these Cisco Talos blog posts about some of the compromises they went through, I would highly recommend you do so, especially from an enterprise security perspective. And I'm not doing that to call Cisco out. I'm doing that to give a nod to the attackers. Because if anyone thought that simply turning on multi-factor authentication would solve all of your problems, the very first part of that case study, or the very first part of that attack, is a focus on how adversaries, quite frankly, did not care that multi-factor was on. It was just another hurdle for them to jump over. So the issue there is that we are starting to get into this place where the supposed switches that you could flip, the supposed technologies that if you just implement this thing, you're safe, you're good to go, you're done, don't worry about it, that is going away. We can't just go buy the new thing or flip that switch. We've got to take a much different approach towards the way that we structure access, the way that we structure applications and resources and services. And in my opinion, and of course, this is aligning with our discussion or our positing of zero trust here, is to focus on where I think adversaries find some of the most success. And I've got a case study we're going to look at in just a moment about that. But one of the places where adversaries find the most success in an environment is with user access capabilities. There's this idea, and zero trust, of course, goes directly against the idea of implicit trust. And implicit trust focuses on that concept of once you're in, you're in. You're in the network, you're good to go. Whether it's through a VPN or you've bypassed that firewall, or in the case of a recent breach, the one that I just talked about, you've passed that multi-factor authentication test, you're in, you're good to go. The problem with that there is what accounts are able to do and able to access is still, in many environments, way too much stuff, way too many resources, way too many capabilities. There's way too many times that a multi-factor authentication or a strong, well-constructed external authentication drops me into a zero or single factor authentication environment. We lose all of the defenses we had on the outside. We lose all of those defenses we had that forced us to get in. So what did we really do? We created a hurdle for our adversaries to get over, which quite frankly, they're used to getting over. But then we just made the rest of it a giant green field for them to run through. We put a hurdle in front of the door, but we did not close it, nor did we find a way for it to be more difficult for them to get in. So zero trust, in my opinion, starts out with that focus on what if I could limit what an account can and can't do. When I say account, I mean a user. What if I can limit what they can and cannot access? Think about things from an application perspective, from a resource perspective, from a file share perspective, from any part of the network perspective. What if I could limit what an account can or can't do, and I can limit it just to the things that they need for their particular role, for their particular job? And what if I could enforce that at all steps of their login? What if I could have a continuous background thing monitoring and making sure, not making sure, but enforcing, actually, I should say denying access to things that they don't need access to? What if we go a step further and say, not only can I limit that, but I can also limit what an account can and cannot move to? And I really start to play on lateral movement in this case, because again, I think about someone getting in with an account, escalating privileges and quickly moving throughout an environment, or quickly moving across third-party applications, abusing API keys, abusing tokens, getting into centralized login platforms, and just abusing that access to get into all sorts of different things. What if I could take that capability away as well? And in my opinion, I think that's one of the things that zero trust goes and answers exactly that particular question. If I take away that concept of implicit trust, I take away, first off, the user's ability to stray from the things that they might need resource to or access to, but I also take away an adversary's capability to get access to those different things as well. We get a few different capabilities baked into here. I get those granular user controls coupled with least privilege access, that zero trust approach, which once again says, no, I'm going to implement a system that monitors my resources, monitors my applications, monitors my services, and assigns policies of access based on least control, based on the minimum amount of access you need to have. This goes way above simply classifying someone as a user or an administrator, which a lot of us see these days. This goes down to the point of saying, no, you need specific access to this thing, no problem. That's as far as you're allowed to go. I don't trust you anywhere else. But here's really I think the better part about this approach. Every time I'm hearing about zero trust or talking about this or researching this, I'm not viewing this as some sort of solution that we bolt on top of an environment and then now we need to go hire a bunch of zero trust folks to maintain this thing for us. I'm talking about all of these concepts: adaptive, dynamic, recognizing user access, resource requirements, identifying resources dynamically, and assigning policies as the organization grows. That's preventing N+1 applications, N+1 instances, N+1 systems, resources, whatever it may be, from accidentally falling outside of the fold, from accidentally falling outside of those well-created policies. And unfortunately, again, removing that capability, removing that zero trust policy we've put on top of things. So one of the case studies that I dropped in here, and it's in the paper as well, but one of the things that I focused on as a way to kind of demonstrate what that implicit trust looks like has been through the form of a really simple, and I'm talking like high level ransomware incident. And I've got a really quick diagram in here, but I just took two different sites, two different networks, if you will. And typically the way you'll see a lot of these incidents unfold is an adversary gets into an environment, whether it's a vulnerability, whether it's a compromised account, whether it's persistent multi-factor authentication abuse, whether it's, some form of other, whatever it may be, some form of other access, they find their way into an environment. From there, it quickly becomes a goal of the same old tactics and techniques: escalating privileges, moving laterally throughout the network, finding the data that is important to keeping the business operational, backup servers, file servers, various financial systems. And a lot of times now we're seeing ransomware progress to a state of extortion, progress to a state of data theft and extortion via data theft. I read an article the other day that someone talked about moving away from ransoming in general and just extorting organizations for data. After all you're really trying to do is just stay out of the front page of the newspaper, right? But my point is, adversaries find a lot of success because of that implicit trust model. I did the wonderful homework of going through and reading the manuals, the READMEs, for a lot of the post-exploitation frameworks that are out there. And I highly recommend, if you're in a defense role, you go and you do the exact same thing, because guess what you're going to read in between the text? The ability to escalate privileges, the ability to get to that state of post-exploitation. Folks, those toolkits, those frameworks, they assume that that's going to be, that can happen. They assume that that's going to take place. Oh, you may need to run a few commands to get there. Maybe we need to hot processes. Maybe we need to change our, change our code a little bit, or our exploit, our in-memory exploit. Maybe we need to change the process we're hijacking. Maybe there's a few little variables that need to change. But if I read a 500-page user manual on post-exploitation activity, escalating privileges or moving laterally is on page 100. The other 400 pages are dedicated towards what to do next. That concept of escalating, that concept of being able to get access to the things that you, or not you, but an adversary wants access to, is very much assumed in this day and age. And I think there's a dangerous precedent in that, because it sets us up to fail. It sets us up to fail if we say, oh, well, all an adversary has to do is get in and then they're done. That's it. In which case I'd counter and say, well, cool. How can I then tackle the problem from that position? If I have to assume that they're going to get in, then cool, let's go ahead and solve that problem first. How do I limit what they can do once they're in? And again, that leads us towards the zero trust capability. Now, as a framework, as a model, as I mentioned, we do lean pretty heavily on the NIST framework. And I'm going to look this up really quick and drop a link for everyone into the chat here. But it's NIST SP 800-207. I'm going to drop a link into the chat for everyone right now, just in case you're interested in following up on this as well. But in going through this, we really get an idea of how the government has started to define zero trust architecture, or zero trust network access, if you will, how they've put that model forward and what that's going to be looking like going forward for organizations. And I think they did a really good job of putting together a really simple diagram of what zero trust architecture looks like. And we've got two different sides of this, the data plane and the control plane. And again, this is for folks who maybe have heard these words and are kind of like, Matt, I'm not really sure what's going on here, what this means. But for some of you who may already be down this road, you might already be familiar with some of these terms and have some of these in place. But zero trust relies very, very heavily on policies. And policies are handled in a few different places. First off, if you can see, as our user walks through trying to get access to trusted resources, or to resources that are in the enterprise, there's an enforcement point that they've got to go through. That enforcement point is a continuous monitoring, a continuous back and forth between what's known as the policy decision point. And that policy decision point is the one saying who's requesting access to what, are they allowed to, at what level, how long potentially will I grant them access, how long will I grant them access for, are there things that I should not be getting them access to? And then also we can wrap that into continually checking to make sure that that policy is done in place. That policy decision point is comprised of the engine and the administrator. Long story short, we're determining access rights, starting with least privilege, starting with nothing, and then granularly adding or scaling from there, meaning I will start to enable or start to allow access to certain resources based on a wide variance of factors here. I'm going to start at 0 and move my way up towards, yes, you can, but here's where I'm going to limit that capability. And it's the policy enforcement point that continues to put that in place at the beginning and during our user sessions. And then perhaps one of my other favorite parts about this architecture as well is once the user session is done, once the session is closed, it is also the job of this architecture to ensure that those access rights are gone, or meaning that session is fully terminated as well. And if anyone here is wondering why that's one of my favorite ones, do me a favor and go take a look at what it's like for an RDP session that isn't closed properly. There's one example of remote access potentially gone wrong, but also I think there's a really good interest in Once a user session is closed, all of the artifacts surrounding that user session, surrounding that policy decision are gone. They're terminated. That session is done for. We do, as I will admit, walk through this in significantly more detail in the paper as well, but I highly recommend anyone who's looking to get into or understand how this framework might apply towards your organization, go check out that NIST guidance on it. The other one I wanted to drop in, the other little tidbit I wanted to take away from this, talks about the approach or the various approaches that can be taken towards zero trust implementation. I picked on what I view as, I think, probably the top 3 approaches that an organization might take, one of the top 3 to get there. How to go and implement this really depends on what I think your parent technology or your parent implementation is going to look like. I know that a lot of you probably have bigger, more security-wide platforms that may sit on top of your organization. Some of them have zero trust capabilities built in that are going to feed off of the engines that are already in place there, meaning you can use these to define policies, but a lot of them are probably going to be down in that third option down here, that network infrastructure and software-defined perimeters. This is, I think, where we're going to see probably a lot of implementations take place, is because as more and more vendors kind of enable or add that zero trust capability on, if they can implement it correctly, they're going to simply say, with platforms already there, just utilize that into place as well. However, there's 2 other approaches that I think allow for a little more rapid adoption than some organizations might think. The first starts with identity governance. And this is really, again, looking at the identity of users and the resources as that key component of policy creation, meaning I'm deciding in a very granular manner who needs access to what and just to what extent, and not going above that particular extent. I akin this to one of my favorite conversations ever that I've had dozens and dozens of times, which is really around the, hey, I want to run a test instance of something. Let's do a POC. Let's try this software, try this technology, whatever it may be. And the user guide recommends that a new account be created with domain administrator privileges for the purpose of the POC. And I kind of look at that and I say, this is a great example of where I, as an organization, should step back and should say, why are you asking for this many privileges in order to do what you need to do? And I hate to say it, but in an Active Directory domain, sometimes it's easier to just select star all the privileges than it is to get to that granular user identity or that identity governance position of, I'm going to limit based on profiles, based on predefined privileges, what users should have access to. The second type of implementation, or I should say the third as I'm going through them, it's the second one down, but it's the third from a discussion perspective, is microsegmentation. And this is where we're breaking away from that perhaps network best practice of segmenting off parts of our network and perhaps limiting various access to those segments, but going a step further, if you will, and really placing, groups or sometimes individual resources on very unique network segments and locking those segments down as appropriately. I think this is probably one of the more intensive approaches towards zero trust because it does require a fairly good understanding and some pretty static rules of what may be inside of your environment. And if I start to introduce a hybrid cloud environment as well, it may get a little dicey, a little tricky, because if someone spins up an incident or an instance in the wrong segment or something like that, zero trust would, of course, limit access to that instance. They would limit what users could do against that instance, but that might not be what my ultimate goal was. Might end up with a lot of wasted time if that's the case. But that being said, it is another approach that can be taken. And for fairly static environments or for environments that have a little fluctuation and you've got a team that's able to define pretty well who needs access to what. And I start to think about manufacturing organizations, factories, plants, places where machinery is pretty much set in stone and I've got years in between swaps and replacements and sometimes even decades. It would be very, very simple. I shouldn't say simple, but I would say it'd be easier than the other approaches to go ahead and just micro segment things off there and prevent, access by unknowing parties and things like that. So that being said, I've got 2 case studies here that we're going to talk about. And the goal is to, discuss how zero trust might be able to change these. Some of this is going to feel a little bit like, hey, Matt, this sounds like a concept we talked about. Let's just see it in action. But I want to go through these quickly before I get to my panel and bring everyone there on board. Because again, I'm looking forward to kind of seeing the back and forth between what we've all got on this particular concept here. Now, again, the one I looked at here was limiting adversary access. Full disclosure to everyone, this case study, this paper, the majority of this paper was written before that Cisco incident I talked about a little bit earlier, but I did find it, an interesting real world example to look to of, hey, here's a persistent adversary who broke through a protected layer of access and unfortunately got access to just way too many things. But I'll use VPN as that kind of control mechanism here. And this is, of course, where users from around the globe, various different roles, will utilize the same entry point to gain access to an organization. And from there, sometimes depending on their roles, sometimes maybe depending on some of the segmentation or some of the division that the security teams put into place. But a lot of times I see a lot of organizations, you VPN in, you cross through that multi-factor barrier, and now you're into a single factor or implied or implicit trust environment where your ability to go through and access resources, whether they're on-prem, in the cloud, third party, homegrown, whatever it may be, it is fairly easy to get through. It's fairly straightforward for you to, log into VPN and all of a sudden your file share comes alive. Your ability to access other servers comes alive. Your ability to run scans of other things in the network, discoverable devices, all that kind of stuff, all turn alive once that VPN is turned on. And I think that implicit trust creates a little bit of an issue here because all I have to do as an adversary is compromise any account, and I'll get access to a wide range of resources. Now, before anyone says it, you might have just said under your breath too, I'm not saying that the engineering department has the exact same access as the marketing or the accounting department or the HR department. Yes, at the surface, some of those accesses are very, very different. Meaning they might have access to different types of resources, but I would still make an argument about how much access they've been given to various types of things and whether or not that's the appropriate level of access. But then I also equate this to think about if I'm an adversary and I want to defeat this, how would I go about, potentially compromising the account that I want? Well, think of adversaries who conduct widespread phishing attacks. If I can get multiple credentials into an environment, I now have a really interesting form of persistent access. And this is maybe another consideration for organizations as well. Usually when it comes to recovering from an incident or responding to an incident, a lot of time is spent on which accounts do we need to reset, which accounts do we need to change the password for, so on and so forth. But if I'm an adversary who just has that kind of sleeper credential that I've never even used, that's another form of persistence back into the environment. And N+1, my adversary already knows the file shares. They already know all sorts of places to go. They already know the locations, the IP addresses, the host names, so on and so forth. So they're entering the environment a much more educated adversary as well. So we, of course, dropped in a little bit of a different approach here that simply said, well, you know what, let me take what was a kind of just pool of collected resources and applications, and let me be very, very strategic about how much access folks actually have to things. So with that implicit trust removal, we now say to my users, that policy decision point comes in and says, during your session, you only have access to these certain things. I can drop policies in based on resources, based on user identities, based on software-defined network perimeters. Again, depending on whichever implementation we go after, that simply comes back and says, if you don't need it, you don't get it. If your role right now is to access a particular cloud application, and that's the extent of what you need access to right now, then guess what? That's what we're going to be limiting your access to in this case. Now, if I simply take this graph here and I replace user with adversary, well, guess what? I've now limited what my adversaries actually have access to, if they can even get past this, if you will. And of course, we're not including all of the various details and metadata that might go into that policy decision point that's taking place. But my goal here is to limit how much damage an adversary could do. And I think limiting that access really succeeds in this particular architecture or this particular model. Now, the other case study that we'll drop in here is going to be one about securing a hybrid environment. This is where I take the exact same approach of simply saying, hey, I'm aware there's a lot of enterprises out there that have, all sorts of resources scattered across different cloud providers, different on-prem models, so on and so forth. And I think that the access for those is the exact same. I didn't necessarily focus on the adversary side of this. I focused more on an environment that's changing, spinning up different instances every single day or every single minute, or having load balance design or demand balance design, which scales up as customers need more and scales down as customer needs less. I think a zero trust implementation goes a step further and recognizes that and automatically goes through and identifies the various assets and resources that are out there and applies the policies as necessary. The nice thing about this is my dev team, and I said it earlier, and I want to say it again, my development team, my sales team, my marketing team, my engineering team, my whoever it may be team, they can move as quickly as they need to. They can build scalable resources. They can utilize other technologies and other services with our cloud providers or with our on-prem organization or our on-prem networks. And we're not creating any unnecessary security gaps or unnecessary security holes there. I'm not deploying applications having multi-factor over 99% of my org, but putting single factor over there. Again, the goal is to have that unified point of least privilege access, removing that implicit trust. And before I continue to sound too much like a broken record, really limit what accounts can do. So that way users can still function, can still do their jobs as necessary, but it makes it a lot more difficult for anyone with malicious intent to exploit those accounts to a further step. Now, really quick, I am going to ask my panelists to come on board as well. And I'm going to go back to our first slide, everyone, and bring their names up just so everyone can see who that is. Tom, John, and Tal, hopefully you're there with us. Before I do that, though, I did see a little bit of chatter in the question and answer window. For anyone who's got a question, it looks like mostly comments and stuff. For anyone who's got a question, feel free to throw it into the Q&A window. We'd love to have you in there. And then I did also notice one of the attendees had raised their hands. We won't be bringing anyone off mute for questions. If you've got a question, feel free to please throw it into the Q&A window, and then I'll ask it to our panel and we'll kind of go from there. So I wanted to iron that out before we got there. But with that said, I'll go ahead and introduce my panel. And just so everyone knows, the way that you all came on camera, I got Tom, Tal, and then John. So Tom, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself. You're the Director of Product Marketing over at ExtraHop. We'd love to know a little bit about you, who you are, what you're doing here, and maybe one of your key takeaways from the paper.
Hey, Matt. Yes. So I come with, I have 20 years of experience in the security industry, and actually identification was my starting job, working for companies that do MFA, and at the time those were just certificates. I'm director of product marketing at ExtraHop, and also have a strong experience in the cloud, working for companies like AWS, for instance.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. All right, Tal, over to you. Introduce yourself to us.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. Happy to be here. So my name is Tal Laufer. I'm VP Product for Perimeter 81. Came from Checkpoint, previously, and we are basically building a ZTNA, SASE, zero trust model kind of product. So I'm super interested in everything that was just said here. I loved a lot of the points you mentioned, Matt. Maybe we can talk about them a little bit later, but specifically from the paper, I love the emphasis on closing down on all the gaps that organizations forget about, like things that like session that is specific to a user and is ending every time the user is disconnected or their computer goes to sleep. The ZTNA capability of that is really magnificent in a way that it really closes the gap so that nobody can really reutilize the session or hack the session itself. And this is a feature that is super strong, but is often forgotten. So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. And John, last but not least.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having us. I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight. I've been here about 4 years. I've spent my entire career in cybersecurity representing endpoint products, identity verification, privacy security, and network security for the last couple of years. I think when I was getting my mind wrapped around zero trust a couple of years ago, when I was getting my feet wet in network security, I think the first thing that kind of struck me as a marketing kind of guy was like, is it really zero trust? Like there's trust is still given, and it's given quite frequently. It has to for business operations. And from a naming perspective, it was helpful for me at the beginning to think about it more as a dynamic trust environment, moving away from static trust environments. And I think, reading the paper and talking to customers about zero trust, one thing I always like to talk about and think about with customers is kind of who's watching the watchers, because yes, you're going to microsegment your network in this way. Yes, you're going to implement this authentication. yes, you're going to deal with cloud infrastructure, VPN, and all those great things. And you're going to move away from like statically, endlessly trusting devices and hosts and such. But who's going to watch the systems and the policies and the changes that you're making to your system? Because each one of those systems and changes and policies and people will, have telemetry and visibility and verification. But what if they fail? Or what if they're compromised? Or what if something changes in your business that the systems and policies can't accommodate? Like the velocity of change in organizations is just crazy today. So selfishly, it certainly serves our business interest to think about that question, but it is a really important question to think about. Is who's watching the watchers once you've made all these changes in your system and are following a zero trust kind of architecture and strategy.
Yeah, I think, John, you bring up an interesting point. I have an easy answer for you. Well, it's not really an answer. It's more of a don't a gotcha, if you will. Who's watching the watchers? Just make sure it's someone that we know or someone who's on our security team, because a lot of time it ends up being adversaries. And that's I think, an important start. That's a little bit of sarcastic, cheeky answer. But I think you bring up an interesting point, perhaps, or I'm going to use that to bring up maybe, my first kind of opinion on that is, I think what John just described is really control. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean control over the things in my environment, control over, what folks have access to, but then really getting control over, John, you described it, Tom and Tal, I know you feel the same way as well. Just the rapid dynamic changing that we've got to deal with in environments today. I don't know, feel free to nod your head along if I'm right, shake your head no if I'm wrong. A lot of security teams have trouble keeping up. They really do. They have trouble keeping up with how fast things move these days. Now, let me be clear. Sometimes when I talk about this, I make it sound like there's developers over there just like spinning up, 1,500 EC2 instances every second. There's a security team like just, clamoring around like mice in a maze and that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about that type of speed. I'm talking about a development team who harnesses a technology and the security team doesn't find out until 8 months later that something had happened. And guess how the security team finds out? If the first word that popped into your head was breach or intrusion, ding, 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 you're correct. The number of times that something gets breached or you see some Twitter thread or some ransomware dark web post or whatever it is about, hey, I have access to a particular thing. I guarantee you there's a security person out there who's like, I didn't even know we did that. And sure enough, here we are, and I've always had this issue, and I've said it on multiple webcasts before. I've always had this issue with your job is to protect the environment, but we're not going to tell you about what's in it. And I think that's a big hurdle for organizations to get over. So with that said, I want to go into, we've got some questions lined up, some from the audience, and I think, some really good starting points as well. Tom, I'm going to come to you first because you've been quiet the longest, just because I had you introduce yourself first. But I want to kind of go back to, I want to take this discussion of zero trust and go back a little bit in time. We've had a couple of questions come in about like, well, can I just like use a VPN for this? In fact, one person asked in particular, like, how does this compare with a VPN that I've already got in place? And then someone else asked, does this just replace VPNs? Meaning, do we not even, like, are you guys talking about something I don't even need? What are your thoughts, Tom, on like, if VPNs could do all of this, why don't we just use VPNs?
Well, there are several thoughts. First of all, VPN. There's a lot of talk in the industry about how VPN is dead, and about how, because VPN creates a lot of issues, actually, issues in terms of segmentation of the networks, but also issues in terms of managing those credentials and managing the access. So we need to go beyond VPN. My personal take is that we should always multi-layer security, and we know that VPN has a lot of security flaws. So the idea of zero trust is to go beyond that and be able to check the credentials on a regular basis. You don't trust. That's the first thing, versus the VPN approach, which is that, hey, you get the credential, okay, you're good, and you can go on the VPN. That's with the zero trust approach. When you have a zero trust mentality, VPN is actually scary because you don't check, you don't renew the credential, you don't verify the credentials often enough, and so that's why I recommend having a zero trust and not solely basing access security on the VPN.
All right, Tal, what do you got to add on there? I mean, can any differing points? Can VPN just do all this for us? We don't need something new, right?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. So I think I may surprise people here by saying yes, potentially a VPN could do, some of these things that we're talking about in terms of the segmentation, in terms of limiting the specific access to specific groups and personnel. Yes, you could do that with certain types of VPN.
Excuse me, I'm sorry,
Hey,
Tal.
hey, Tal. Yeah, the
yeah.
audio's a little choppy. Tal,
Yeah.
it sounds like
Okay.
we caught you on the set of a Transformers movie.
Right.
All right, let me just close a few things out here on my computer. Is it better now?
It is better now. Yeah. If you want to take a moment, I can go to John. If you want to take a moment and check things, but if you think you're good, go for it.
Yeah, I think I'm good. Let me
Okay.
know if there's any other problem.
All right, we'll do.
So I'm just saying, yes, theoretically, you could do with VPN the things that were just mentioned, like limiting the access to specific groups and personnel, and creating kind of granular access to specific resources. You could do that with a VPN, with certain types of VPN, but it will make your configuration so cumbersome and so complicated to manage that it's just not going to be manageable. The ease of use in terms of defining what resources and what people and groups can access them is so simple by the fact of having zero trust enabled, because again, it does not assume any kind of trust, right? It has default as no to everyone, and you just open up the gates to those people and places that you wanna make sure are working. And that's a different paradigm. It's a very different thought process there, and it makes the network management much more simple when you look at it that way.
I like it. John, anything to add on, especially from the network security side, sir? I'm leaning on you for I mean, everyone's got insight into this space, but I know exactly what you guys are into from a network security perspective. Can VPNs just handle all this?
Yeah, to Tal's point, it can do a lot in the zero trust space. It definitely can't do it all. I think the other thing I'll add is we see in our customer base globally a lot of increase in VPN usage. So I think VPN is far from dead. The remote work shift from the pandemic it seems to be a lasting one across our customer base. And then, what are some of the examples of where VPN is going to fall short or not even begin to help? I mean, internal east-west traffic patterns, right? Like you're inside your organization, you've got developers sitting at a physical HQ, right? So imagine they're not remote working, and east-west traffic, database, intra-database, right? Like what is your visibility strategy there? Or cloud workloads, right? In your Amazon, AWS workloads, a new team just spins up a new critical business application in an already permissioned, already authorized space, right? What's your strategy there? Like the VPN logs are not, that's not going to help you out in that case. And there's many examples like that. There's certainly a role, I think, for VPNs to play, and a lot they can do. And to my first point, I don't see them going away anytime soon based on what we're seeing.
John, you brought up an interesting point. I think, Tal, you were leaning towards this as well. You both brought up an interesting point, which, John, specifically, you mentioned VPN logs. And that is perhaps one of the interesting parts of really any implementation that gets put out there. And of course, this is me putting on my incident responder hat for just a moment and thinking well, who's going to watch the watchers, right? How can I get those policies in place? Well, what types of artifacts am I going to have in place to help me decipher those policy decisions when accounts were given access to things? Maybe that's as an interesting roundabout, maybe perhaps the reason why VPN doesn't provide all the solutions here, or it could provide some, but as you both have pointed out, not all that we need, because quite frankly, it also will result in lower capability to audit, or a lesser capability to audit what actually happened when the user was connected, if you will. And I would argue that a security team probably wants more visibility than less into what happened there. And, to simply say, oh, this account VPN'd in at 8 a.m. Pacific time, I can see it. It's kind of cool. Well, when they were in, what happened, right? What did they do? Oh, I don't know. Let me go search the SIM for every single log that's out there and see what happened. And then we're playing this huge game of, wait, what if I could determine at the policy level what that user was allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do? I think it would make things a lot easier from that perspective. So with that said, I'm going to go on to our next question here. Now, I do see some of you have been asking some things into the chat. There's a pretty long question that came in. I'm going to take a moment to digest while our panel goes through and discusses this one here. There's an interesting question that came in about the use of agents. And the question says, does zero trust access require the use of an agent on endpoint devices? And this may be a question that looks at the architecture, but Tom, I'll come to you first. And then John, I'm going to come to you, and then Tal, I'm going to come to you last on this one, just so y'all can prepare for this one and get lined up. But any thoughts about like the use of an agent in this case? I don't think this is a common approach we're seeing, but you tell me if I'm wrong.
So yes, I think the use of agent is, Tal can definitely provide more detail about this. I see you nodding your head. The use of agent is an issue in many places, because I see where this question is going. You have nowadays you have a lot of devices that cannot take an agent, and so you need to manage the access for those devices. I'm thinking about IoT devices in particular, or just simply connected devices. So one of the things that is critical to zero trust is actually the inventory stage, where you have to make an inventory of the devices that you have to control, and the resources, not just devices, the resources that you for which you have to control the access, and also an inventory of all the credentials. And this is the reason why a lot of people are thinking that zero trust might be very cumbersome to implement. In reality, when you have a device, when you have a security system that does this inventory automatically, then you can easily implement the agents when you have to implement agents, or implement zero trust without agents. And Tal, I see you nodded. So,
John, any thoughts on that? Or Tal? Then Tal, I'm gonna let Tal answer last, because she's over there like really, really waiting to answer.
Yeah, I think it always surprises me. It shouldn't, but it always surprises me when I'm talking to customers and security teams about how much they struggle with inventory and asset management from an endpoint perspective. And to your point, right, not everybody's got a Mac or a PC that you can just drop one of these best-in-class EDR agents on. I think my thoughts here from like zero trust perspective is, like, from the network side, it's your lever to supplement all of your asset management that should be occurring at the IT side of the house and your team. But it's a really great way, because in theory, right, those unmanageable agents, whether they're IoT or something, have to make network side communications. And if you're there and positioned to capture and inventory that can be a feeder system into, we can't put an agent over here because for whatever reason, operating system supportability, but at least we have inventory of these sorts of systems coming in and can make policy decisions, architecture decisions, system authentication decisions based on the fact that we know these exist. We can't actually manage them. But it's better than not knowing. It's certainly better than not knowing. So yeah, I think lean on your network to manage the unmanageable devices. And first of all, identify them, and second of all, manage them, even if you can't directly touch them.
All right, Tal, you're over here nodding your head. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, these are all good points. That's actually a fascinating subject that we're just discussing internally a lot. But I'll give you the bottom line, right? Eventually, ZTNA or the secure access need to be democratized. They need to be access to all devices, all types of access, because you want to make sure you control all of them. And that means that you have to provide agents for different types of platforms, or if you don't, then you need to find clever solutions to actually provide the same level of control and access granularity, so that you will be able to keep on managing those assets no matter what device they are being accessed from, right? So that includes, mobile devices, Linux devices, of course, Mac and Windows. It would also include IoT, as mentioned, right? Because you need to make sure on those. But you also need to make sure that you provide agentless access for any kind of BYOD type of device. So there's a very wide variety of use cases here that we have to cover if we want to make sure we keep the security tight.
I like it. All right, everyone's got a really good, I think a really good stance on this one. So John, I think you mentioned this in your answer, so I'll come to you first on this one here, John, because you brought this up, and I think this might be an interesting discussion here. But a question that came in, and basically one of our attendees has said, hey, everyone, this is a great concept if you have a Microsoft or a Mac, or Windows, or a PC or a Mac, if you will. I feel like one of those old commercials. I'm a Mac, I'm a PC, but they call out the point about what about Linux as a workstation? And they've kind of talked about that the majority of solutions fall down on Linux, and it looks like only TLS is valid, but at least VPN can still check device posture. I think it's an interesting point, because at least I know when I discuss or talk about, ZTNA, I don't really think about things in an operating system sense, or in a in a operating system success or failure, I think about it more from a resource perspective. I think about it more from a, should a user be able to access this thing? Yes or no, but perhaps it's possible that ZTNA could be, I don't know, somewhat confused by the protocols or confused by the OS. John, what are your, any thoughts on that one? Any thoughts on this question that came in?
So I'm rereading it. There seems to me to be a few questions in there. Can you give me something a little more direct? Like what specifically would you like me to comment on?
Do we think zero trust fails again if someone brings a Linux system to the table?
Okay. Again, no, because a Linux system has an IP address at the end of the day, right? And yes, there may be proprietary protocols. There may be encrypted protocols, right, which block traditional points of like understanding the risk of that system coming into your environment. But at the end of the day, like there has to be an IP address connecting in or out for these systems, and that's your opportunity to inventory and begin to interrogate where you can in those systems. And the other thing I'll say to that is we see this a lot with talking to our customers. There's a lot of that if you get the crumb of something, like if you get just the like, I know that this is a Linux-based system, it's coming into my environment, I don't have capability set around it, but at least I know it's there. The contextual clues from other parts of your organization related to that system or that part of your network are often very, very helpful to directionally put you in the right, like you may not be able to see what's happening on the endpoint that may be unknown to you, but you'd be surprised how often you can pair it with contextual clues of things you do have access to be able to make decisions, block, admit kind of things. I see it again and again. There's always, you've got a thread and you pull on it. There's just so much interconnectedness in network infrastructure that there's just an amazing amount of inference you can make about something that you don't necessarily have endpoint coverage on or direct visibility into. So yeah, I don't think it has a role, and I think it survives Linux systems. You just have to think about it a little differently.
Tom, any agreement or disagreement?
I absolutely agree. Absolutely. And there are multiple ways. As I mentioned before, you need to have a multi-layer security approach. No approach is foolproof, but zero trust is definitely bringing a lot of progress in terms of the security postures. The other thing is that you mentioned the flows of MFA early in your presentation, Matt, and you mentioned the issue of people putting their whole trust on MFA, on multi-factor authentication, and I think we should not put our whole trust in zero trust. We should definitely invest in zero trust. We should definitely strengthen our security postures with zero trust approaches. But we should always have a backup security system. Once a threat is inside your network, what are you doing? Don't just put the perimeter. Strengthen your perimeter. Have a very strong perimeter as much as possible, but also have the proper multi-level of detections, like John was mentioning, and the security systems in place in your network, so that once the threat is inside the network, you can still catch it and you can still minimize the blast radius.
I like that. Tal, I see you nodding along there. Anything to add?
No, actually, I think they covered it perfectly.
Awesome. All right. Hey, Tom, don't hit that mute button. I'm coming right back to you on this. Another question came in. I like this one because it's something that I did not explore too much in the paper. Does not mean it's irrelevant, just an important thing. What are some of the most common mistakes or things that you've seen overlooked when implementing zero trust? What are some, and I'll leave the question just at that. What are some things that, perhaps someone may have overlooked, maybe didn't think about? And, either I'll add on to this question. And I'll say to each one of my panelists here, perhaps what is maybe the recourse or the recovery from that? Or was it was it kind of like, oh, we found a blind spot. We found something that, needed an extra level of segmentation or extra level of detection, or, an extra level of something wrapped around it because it was, a mistake, or it was a visibility gap that we didn't really think of before. So Tom, I'll come to you first on that one, giving you enough time now, leading the question on.
Thank you. And I alluded to some of these already, but the first thing I would mention is the defender's dilemma. The idea is that we have the attackers can always attack. They can always try again and again and they can decide when they're going to attack you, where they're going to attack you, how they're going to attack you, and so on. So they have the advantage outside of your network. And so the first mistake is that I've seen is improper inventory of your resources and of your and that leads to an incomplete security posture, an incomplete zero trust implementation. And so that's the first thing. The most important thing is know what resources you have on your network, know how they're protected, and identify which ones need to have a proper zero trust implementation or not. In order to do that, you need to have a system that does the inventory for you, that's going to help you. As some people on the panel just mentioned, networks and resources are so complex today that you cannot do this on your own. So that's the first thing that I would mention. The second thing that I would mention in terms of implementation issues with zero trust is the fact that you have to implement a zero trust approach, but you also have to look for other ways. As we mentioned on this discussion, we talked about devices that are manageable and some that are not manageable, that can have an agent and some that cannot have an agent. And so you have to you cannot put your whole faith, your whole security on just one technology, one security approach. So that's the other thing that I would mention.
Nice. Okay. Tal, how about you? Any mistakes or common things overlooked?
Yeah, I think the most common mistakes are configuration errors, right? Eventually there are people and there's a human factor that is configuring this, zero trust kind of system. And eventually they're the ones creating the rules. And, a simple mistake or typo can actually open up the access to a bunch of, resources that should not have been, exposed at all to the users. So the most common mistake would be some kind of a configuration error. We also see some of our customers or users that don't use MFA. And I'm still surprised because, MFA just, allows you to close the gate against so many different types of threats, right? Every type of, credential theft or authentication or hack could be, many of them can be prevented by just using MFA, which is so common these days. So, I'm still surprised when people don't use that.
Yeah, the number of times, how do I phrase this correctly without making myself look like a certain way? Tell you what, for everyone in security who's out there, I'll just say this statement in general. The amount of money that's been paid for reports that simply say implement multi-factor auth is a lot. Let's put it that way. John, when Tal started talking about users and people creating policies, you were nodding your head vigorously. Anything to add on that one?
big +1 to misconfiguration mistakes. So yeah, I think that's a huge tactical series of mistakes that we see. And I think it comes in part from like zero trust isn't a technology, isn't a policy, it's a practice. It's all of those things. It's ongoing, which means, okay, like you make a specific configuration, a specific part of your network at a specific point in time. You should have a plan to be regularly revisiting that policy. Like it shouldn't be like oh, weird, we're seeing a device over here that we shouldn't have been seeing. Oh, shoot, we left that port open. Oops, right? Like, that's fine. We all make mistakes, but don't let the device getting on that part of the network be the moment that you discover it. Why don't you discover that on a quarterly basis when you do kind of an inventory of configuration? So treat zero trust like a practice, which means everything you're doing from policy, technology, and people perspective should have a plan for continually revisiting it and monitoring the quality of that particular practice or the fact that it's even being honored. And then the other thing too is, this is kind of a macro kind of mistake, is make sure your decisions, your technologies, and your policies are resilient as much as they can be to the fact that your business is going to be changing so much. So like the AWS space example, right? Like in a permissioned, like trusted space, like scenario plan, like, okay, today, these are the business applications running in the space. Within our current framework, we also allow this team to create new critical business applications. Will we know that happens if they don't call us on the phone or email us and tell us they're doing that? No. How could we know if that's going to happen? What kind of permissions might they try to add to the system? Would we see those? Like scenario plan a little bit. Obviously don't impact the business and lock stuff down so much that you're going to get angry, business operations people yelling at you. But try to make your systems and choices in zero trust as resilient as you can to the fact that like the velocity of change is just accelerated. And the communication breakdown, right, between security and the rest of the organization, especially IT, is unfortunately seemingly only to be getting worse because of the complexity and scale of change. So like, what systems or what technologies can you implement to make yourself as resilient as you can be to that fact that your organization is a living, breathing, growing blob?
I like it. A very, very good way to describe, I think, from all three of you. You know, this is not just, and maybe I'll turn this in. I actually had a question come in that I think all three of you answered as well. And I'd love for any more feedback on this if I'm wrong. But I think that what I'm hearing the three of you say is that zero trust is not just some switch that we go flip and we're done. That's it. You know, it's not like I wake up Monday, someone read about, you know, zero trust over the weekend and we're good to go. Right now, the reason I dropped this example in here, and I'm happy to let anyone kind of speak up on this, is I've seen organizations wake up on Monday single factor and go to bed Monday night multi-factor. I've seen some of those implementations take place. That's not an impossible thing to start to implement over the course of a day. And hats off to the vendors that make it super easy to do that. But what I'm hearing you all say is that this is really a shift of the way that we secure access to resources. This is not a switch that gets flipped. It's an approach. It's an architecture. It's a model. Tal's nodding along vigorously. Tom, anything? Am I wrong? Any disagreement? I like asking for this because you can just say no and then I'm right.
Are you asking Tal or myself?
You, Tom. Sorry, Tal's over there like nodding vigorously.
I agree.
I know Tal's stance already.
Yeah, I'm good.
I agree with you 100%. It's that's why I was nodding.
All right, perfect. Okay, everyone's nodding. All right, I like that. Tom, tell you what. Let me keep with you on something right here. Another question that's come in, and I've spent a few minutes trying to think about this one here. Does zero trust remove defenses that we've got in place? Meaning, can I just simply say, oh, all that stuff that I bought 3-4 years ago, the contract's over, I don't need to keep those things. We'll just implement a zero trust model. And I no longer need, you know, network detection. John, I know you're going to have something to say about that. I no longer need endpoint detection. I no longer need these things because I'm limiting what my adversary can do. So maybe, and we've got a little under 10 minutes. This might be the last question because I'd love everyone's thoughts on this. We'll see how long we go through this one.
Yeah, I think.
But go ahead.
I'm happy to answer that. So the way I see security is really in terms of the flow of the attack, and usually what you have is you have the intrusion, and in order to prevent intrusion, you have to set up your perimeter defenses, and zero trust is part of this. So zero trust is added to the other tools that you may have on the perimeter. It's not, I don't think it's removing anything other than just strengthening. You mentioned MFA, for instance. So you had simple authentication. You still have authentication with MFA, and now you have MFA with zero trust. So it's a built up on the technologies and the security. And you have to have, as I mentioned before, you have to have a multi-layered security approach. But then there's more than intrusion. There's also what we call the mid game, and the mid game is once the threat is inside your network, you have to have network detection, and you have to have a response as well. Otherwise, the threat is going to go from mid game to the end game, and the end game is the ransom. It's the damage that the attacker is gonna inflict on your organization. So build up with zero trust, but don't remove the security layers that you have. The way to think about zero trust is it's built on your existing security, not replacing your security.
Valid point. John, what do you got?
Tom summarized it nicely. Yeah, it's just, I think about it's like, okay, you've got like analytic capability, you've got telemetry capability, data, right, to validate analytics and or proactively look for problems. You've got authentication, identity verification, and you've got kind of configuration, permission, services management. Those are kind of like the 4 basic buckets. And it's like, you've already invested in tools to address all of those things, presumably at some level of your organization. With zero trust, it's just like, you may be shifting a little bit of the investment areas, and you're definitely going to be probably shifting where in your organization, virtually speaking, you're increasing or decreasing some of those investments, right? And so I don't think it's like to Tom's point, it leverages your existing tools. You just may be shifting the priority of deployment investment areas of those deployment, because at the end of the day, those kind of four basic things, like I'd be hard pressed to argue you don't need those four capabilities in place in critical parts of your organization. How you get them is up to you, but
Agreed.
But not having a detection capability on the network side or endpoint side, just because you think your authentication is perfect and it's encrypted, oof, I wouldn't put myself in that position.
Tal, anything to add on?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to say, going to express a different opinion here on this one. I do think that zero trust, I do think that zero trust actually may replace some of the existing infrastructure for security. I agree that, it should be adding to the security total level of the organization, but remember what we started from, right? Zero trust actually removes the access or removes the trust from everybody in the organization and kind of builds it back up from the ground up, right? So if you had a legacy VPN that allowed every user full access to the entire system, and you are moving away from that and moving to a zero trust access model, you're actually should be depreciating your VPN because it still leaves a hole in your network and actually allows users to access resources you may not want them to access. So ZTNA, or zero trust network access, or zero trust when it comes to the access world, is actually better off alone when it's the single point of access to those organizational resources, etc., because that's one of the basics on which it's built on.
I like that. I like that, Tal. I don't think I think you didn't offer too much of a contrarian point of view. I think more of a progressive, more of an evolutionary point of view there as well, which I think is a really good one to have. All right. Well, one other thing I'm going to add in here, and I think panel, we've already talked about this. So I'm going to bring this up. We did have a question come in. There's a few questions as well. And for folks, I do apologize. We're not going to be able to get to every single one that's come in. But we do appreciate the feedback. I'm going to try and get as many answered live as we can here. But there was an interesting one that came in that talked about in what extent will regular user training fit into the zero trust policy? Any policy must have a user level vulnerability, more or less. Now, Tom, I think or Tal, you started out by talking about, we've all three talked about, or all four have talked about and agreed upon the users being a potential weak link from a policy creation perspective. But let's look at a user perspective instead, not so much the policy administrators, but more of the users behind this. Do we think this changes the way that, users get informed about what they can or cannot have access to? And I'm going to offer the contrarian side of this. Should it be something just behind the scenes that users shouldn't have to deal with? And maybe of course, maybe we need to make a few policy adjustments here or there, but is this more of a behind the scenes thing? Kind of like security teams aware of what's going on, but to users, it should be transparent? Or would this be more of a kind of, I like to use like phishing links as an example. If I've got a phishing technology that overrides links in an email and sends them through a safe portal, any user can see that URL rewrite take place. How in the face of a user should this actually be? And this will probably be our last question for this one here. So Tom, I'm going to come to you first. Tal, I'm going to go to you second. And then John, I'm going to let you kind of take us home on this one here. But Tom, over to you first. How transparent should this be?
As much as possible. There are some changes that may be implemented depending on how you're currently managing the access to your resources, because you will require or you may require the users to authenticate themselves more often. You just mentioned VPN. So VPN, you log in and then you have access to everything that's on the VPN. So with zero trust, you have to authenticate yourself, and you have to do it several times, depending on the resources and depending on how you're accessing those resources. But other than that, other than just user authentication, there should not be any changes. Everything else, all the trust verification should be happening behind the scene. And so back to my initial answer, as little as possible. We should not, the users, besides authenticating themselves from time to time, they should not see anything else.
I like it. Tal?
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, I'm a strong proponent of training of any sort, but when it comes to zero trust, I don't think there's anything specific you need to touch. You need to teach the users when it comes to the zero trust. What we need to, teach the users is the rules of behavior on the net, right? Identifying those phishing links and identifying those potentially hazardous emails, etc. That's the strong and the most important piece. Zero trust by itself is something that will enable them to work safely within the network of the organization. And it's a way of the organization to protect itself. So they don't necessarily need to get trained on zero trust. They need to get trained on how do they behave inside the organizational network and outside and on the line between those two.
All right. And last but not least, John, what are your thoughts on how transparent should this be? And you're going to be my last answer, my last one of the day here. So I'll let you take us home.
I'm only going to plus one what was just said. I won't say the same thing for the sake of speaking. We're on the same page there. Done right, it should be pretty invisible to the end user beyond the self-authentication.
Love it. Love it. All right. And with that said, everyone, we are right at the end of our webcast. So just to summarize everything up, we talked about what some zero trust architecture approaches look like. We then looked at how zero trust may help mitigate certain threats. And then we got into a great, awesome panel discussion where we looked at various things from older technologies versus zero trust, implementation, ease of implementation, usefulness of implementation, user access, so on and so forth. So I want to say a huge thanks to everyone on my panel. Tom, Tal, John, thank you three so much for joining me here. I think we had a really good informative discussion. Huge thanks to the audience for all your feedback as well. I do apologize. There were some questions we weren't able to get to, but feel free to ping any of us on Twitter, LinkedIn, any of the normal social media sources. We'd love to continue the discussion over there. But with that said, on behalf of SANS, on behalf of all of our sponsors, thanks everyone for joining us. Carol, I'm going to hand it over to you for our final take-home statement. But again, a huge thanks to everyone for joining us today.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt, Tom, John, and Tal for your great presentation. And to Cisco Secure, Corelight, Devo, ExtraHop, and Perimeter 81 for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.